more inflation plus weak yen no longer working for Japan. Formal formula for success failing as the currency falls and the food and the energy costs soar. For years, as Japan tried to spur its chronically weak economic growth, it pursued what its central bank saw as a magic formula: stronger inflation and a weaker yen. It didn't quite work as intended. Inflation never met the government's modest target, despite the rock-bottom interest rate and the heaps of fiscal stimulus. Workers' wages stagnated and the growth remained anemic. Now Japan is suddenly getting what it wished for, just not in the way it had hoped. While overall inflation remains moderate, food and energy costs are rising rapidly, an outgrowth not of increased demand but of market turmoil related to the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the yen has hit a two-decade low against the dollar, a dizzying drop of more than 18% since September. That has unnerved Japanese bidders. The twin forces are posing yet another challenge for the world's third largest economy, and Japan trails the major nation in emerging from the economic blow of the pandemic. The rise in process has spooked Japanese consumers used to decades of stability, and the weak yen is starting to look as if it will depress demand at home more than stimulate it abroad. The yen depreciation is attacking the weakest point of the economy, said T, an economist at the Nomura Research Institute who served on the Bank of Japan's policy board. Households, he said, are facing an increase in prices of every imported good, and the situation is undermining consumer sentiment even in advance of actual inflation. In a previous era, when Japan was a manufacturing superpower, a weak yen would have been cause for celebration, making Japanese exports cheaper abroad, increasing the value of revenue earned overseas and attracting foreign investment. But exporting is now less important to the overall Japanese economy, and the companies seeking to avoid the trade restriction and take advantage of cheaper labor costs have begun to produce more of their product overseas, reducing the impact of the exchange rate on their bottom line. A Bank of Japan report released in January found that although a weak yen continued to aid the economy, its positive impact on exports had shrunk over the decade leading up to the pandemic. Its contribution to inflation, however, had increased during the same period. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine have most likely amplified the negatives and diminished the positives, said An, chief Japan economist at Goldman Sachs. Prices have been rising because of manufacturing shutdowns in China and broader logistics chain snares, as well as the war's impact on exports of Ukraine wheat and Russian gas and the oil. For resource poor Japan, which is highly reliant on imported fuel and food, the drop in the yen has driven already high prices even higher, with the cost of some necessities rising by double-digit percentages for the first time in over a decade. consumers are paying more for acai beer, and one brand of convenience store chicken had its first price increase in more than 35 years. He added, 깜짝이야. 깜짝 놀랐다. He added that the potential upside of the currency devaluation had been further reduced by Japan's decision to continue borrowing international tourists who might be eager to take advantage of a favorable exchange rate. There are a number of reasons for the yen's weakness. Japan's economy had faltered during the pandemic, and the skyrocketing commodity prices have forced importers to sell more yen for dollars to pay their bills. But the main cause, experts say, is Japan's insistence on maintaining interest rate at near zero, even as other central banks, led by the U.S. Federal Reserve, raise their own drastically. The widening spread has triggered a rush to buy dollars as investors look for better return, and the exodus seems likely to continue. Last week, the Fed raised the interest rate half a point, the largest jump in over 20 years, and the Fed said it intended to continue raising borrowing costs as it seeks to cool rapid inflation stoked by a booming American job market and rising wages. Wages in Japan, by contrast, have barely budged, and the country's high employment levels have remained comparatively steady. That means that Japan's inflation, which overall remains under the government's target of 2%, is most likely driven by supply-side issues caused by the war and the pandemic, not the increased demand that low interest rates are intended to produce. In theory, the Bank of Japan could stanch the yen's devaluation by raising interest rate, but its governor, Haruhiko Kuroda, whose term ends next April, seemed to stick with his policies until he achieved inflation of both the quality and the quantity he envisioned nearly a decade ago, when the Prime Minister at the time, Shinzo Abe, nominated him. Modest inflation driven by consumer demand, the thinking goes, would create a virtuous cycle of economic expansion. Companies' profit would grow, spurring investment, wage growth, and domestic consumption. In late April, Mr. Kuroda doubled down on his commitment to low rate, increasing the Bank of Japan's purchase of government bonds. The announcement was followed by a yen setup. Even if Mr. Kuroda wanted to raise the rate, doing so may set up a cascade of economic consequences, said Jin Park, a professor of political science and international relations at Loyola Marymount University, who studies Japanese monetary policy. Japan has come to rely on big spending to stimulate its economy, Mr. Park said, and the raising rate could both make that approach more difficult to continue and make Japan's national debt, which stands at over 200% of its annual economic output, harder to service. While economists disagree about whether that level of debt is sustainable, policymakers are not eager to change it yet. High inflation is politically toxic, and trying to collect for it, the medicine is also an extremely bitter pill, Mr. Park said. If they raise interest rate, that's also going to be unpopular. Like Mr. Kuroda, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has brushed off suggestion that the Bank of Japan should seek to strengthen the yen by raising interest rate. Instead, he had sought to combat rising prices with more stimulus. This year, Parliament has signed up on several rounds of subsidies to Japanese oil companies that are intended to lower gas prices. In April, lawmakers announced an additional round of subsidies and direct cash payments of about $380 to families with children. Some politicians have suggested that the Bank of Japan could shore up the yen's value through currency market interventions, selling its own dollar holdings to lift the Japanese currency. But that's an expensive proposition that is unlikely to have much impact, said Saori, a professor of international relations at the University of Southern California, who studies Japan's trade and monetary policy. These days, the central bank has already given up on intervening in the market. Mr. Decay said the whole market has gotten so big that the actual intervention doesn't change it. It might change it for a few days, but it won't change the trend. More inflation plus a weak yen no longer working for Japan.